There was a little boy who was practicing his violin, and he's screeching with the bow across the, that evil hiss the violin makes. And the dog sitting over there in the fireplace, and the dog starts howling. And the dad is sitting there, resting, trying to read his book, and the dog's just howling, and the violin's just screeching, and he takes it as long as he can, and he looks at his son and he says, "Can you please play something that the dog doesn't know?" Anyway, happy Father's Day. We're going to continue looking today at 1 Samuel, and looking at our series Invoking the Past, Inviting the Future. And the episode we're looking at today is chapters 21 through 24, as David's fleeing because Saul has attempted to murder him several times. We looked last week at the different reactions that Saul and Jonathan and David had to their futures being on shifting sand. And we find David in this episode in and out of caves. In and out of a couple of different caves. And today it's popular to have man caves. Men have their caves. Instead of going to the local watering hole, you have a man cave, right? And a man cave is a place where men can go to either sulk or to recharge. But caves can also be a place where special training occurs. Do y'all remember the cave scene in The Empire Strikes Back? No, don't remember? Well, here, let me remind you of that scene. Well, if nothing else, I at least got the kids' attention for 2 minutes. In that cave, Luke had to face his fears. He had to face his fears, and he had to face the possibility of a future that he didn't like too much. In this phase of life, David invites his future by cultivating what we call a caveman mentality. And this is not a mentality that is just based on brute strength or unintelligible speaking. No, that's not what we're talking about. This is a mentality in which he's going to learn how to rely on God and how to put his future into God's hands. But before we get to the cave, we need to set the stage for David's arrival there at the cave. All right, so he's fled. That's what we saw last week. He's fled away from Saul. And he goes to a place called Nob. He goes to where the tabernacle is and where the high priest Ahimelech is. And he says, I need help. I'm on a secret mission from the king. And I need some food. Do you have any food? And Ahimelech says, well, all I've got is the bread in the temple, the special bread. And David talks him into giving him the bread. So now he has the bread. He says, you have any weapons? And he says, well, all I've got is this big sword of Goliath. He said, well, I'll take it. And so he takes the food and he takes the big sword. And then his bad day gets a little bit worse. Then he goes to the Philistine town of Gath. And Gath, if you don't remember, is the hometown of Goliath. So there he comes, strolling in to town like the old Western, right? The guy riding into the town, and he's got the big sword of Goliath on him. And some townsfolk recognize him. And he says, oh, that's the guy that killed our hero. That's our hometown hero, right? Goliath. He's the one that killed him. And they remember this song. We talked about that last week, that the Philistines even know the song that they're singing. Oh, David's killed his 10,000s. And so David says, uh-oh. I got to do something. I got to figure out, because I'm afraid now the king's going to kill me. They're going to realize that I'm the one that killed their champion, and I'm in trouble. So here's what he does. He tries the insanity defense. It says that he pretended to be insane, scratching on the doors and drooling down his beard, foaming at the mouth, looking like he's a madman. All right? What's hilarious is what the king says to this. The king says, I've got enough madmen, enough foolishness in my life. Get this guy out of here. Now the Jews think that King Gath, they theorize that King Gath had his wife and his daughter were both insane. So you got enough foolishness going on around in your life, even if your greatest enemy comes on your doorstep, you don't want one more bit of foolishness. Get out of my sight, right? And so this is what happens. David now has to flee Gath because he's got to find somewhere else to go. So he ends up in a cave in Adullam. So that's where we find him. Now he's in this cave called Adullam. And at this point, he's at his lowest. Think about what's going on now. Last week and this week, he's lost his wife. He's lost his best friend. He's lost his job. He was the commander of the army. He's lost his prestige that goes with the job. Now in Gath, he's lost his self-dignity. And he's in this cave. And he's as far away from this future of being king as he could possibly think he could be. And he's at the lowest point. At this point, he's at the lowest point in his life. He's got an army tracking him down. He's homeless. And he has some moral failings that he has to deal with that have made consequences for other people. Remember he went to Nob and he got that food and he got that sword of Goliath before he went and acted all insane and lost his own sense of dignity? Well, when Saul finds out that he went to Nob, Saul goes to the priest and says, why'd you help him? Well, David told me he was on a mission for you. David lied. Well, Saul doesn't like anybody that helps his enemy. So Saul feels betrayed and destroys all of the high priest's family. And then he goes and kills the whole village of Nob. All the women, all the children, everybody. Because they aided and abetted his enemy David. So now David feels responsible. My lie, what I did this. One person escapes. One of the sons of the high priest, Abiathar is his name. He escapes and he goes and he runs to David and he tells him about this. And David says, because of what I've done, because of the lie I told, this has happened. So I'm going to protect you. Stay with me and I'm going to protect you. And throughout all of this, David's wrestling in this cave. He's wrestling with this. This cave of his could be a place of sulking. It could be a place where he's invoking the bitter memories of his recent past. And he's just sitting there. He's going to have a pity party for himself. Right? He's got nothing going in his life the way it's planned. Doesn't that happen a lot of times? Nothing in our life goes the way that we planned it out exactly. Everything's been stripped away from us. We make plans to do great things, but often we find ourselves hunkered down in the back of a cave, grappling with our thoughts, grappling and wrestling somehow with God and why God has done this. And these times in the caves can either cause us to go backward in our growth, or it can be the things that propel us forward in our growth with Christ. And so how does David feel through all of this? Well, we know how he feels. You know that psalm that we read, Psalm 142, it's the psalm that was written while he was in the cave. And it was one of the psalms he wrote while he was in the cave. We were going to read it earlier. We're going to read it again. It goes like this. I cry out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before him and tell him all my troubles. When I am overwhelmed, you alone know the way I should turn. Wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me. I look for someone to come and help me, but no one gives me a passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit what happens to me. We used to feel like that sometimes. Then I pray to you, O Lord. I say you are my place of refuge. You are all I really want in life. Hear my cry, for I am very low. Rescue me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison so I can thank you. The godly will crowd around me, for you are good to me. Again, David is away from everything he loves. He's away from everything he knows except God. David doesn't think a soul cares for him. He doesn't think anybody remembers or recognizes his pain. Did you hear the darkness, the depression in that psalm? Did you hear the despair? He's down low. He's in the bottom of the ditch. And when you're in the bottom of the ditch, you only got one place to go. Back up. And God's going to use this time in this cave to train David to become the man and the king that he will eventually be. David doesn't sulk here. He prays in the cave. He doesn't deny the pain. He doesn't deny it, but he doesn't let it define him either. His legacy is not going to be what has gone on in the past. It's going to be to go with God and whatever God has for him in the future. So David doesn't focus on the fact that he's lost everything in his life. He focuses on his spiritual life with God. He focuses on what is the most important thing. He knows that God will give him the right people at the right time. It says, the godly will crowd around me. He remembers that God is good even in the darkest time, in this darkest point, in this cave time, that God is good. And you know what? God does provide what David needs. Probably not in the way that David thinks, as what happens often in our lives. God gives us things not in the way that we expect. But men start to show up at the cave and start joining David. Men show up who will become some of his best friends. Isn't that we find our best friends in the darkest times of our life? And so God provides this purpose for David to become the leader that he's going to be. Here's what it says about these guys that come to join him. His brothers and all his relatives join him, and then others begin coming, men who were in trouble or in debt or were just discontented, until he was a captain of 400 men. So God's obviously providing David with this army that he needs. His family shows up. And perhaps this is because they're being persecuted, right? Because Saul's trying to get to David in any way he can, so they come and they're fleeing as well. But remember, this is the same family that either ignored or dismissed David. Remember that his father didn't even really remember him when Samuel showed up at his house. Oh yeah, that guy, the little boy out there in the field. His brothers, when he went to the battlefield, dismissed him and said, "You're wicked. You have an evil, selfish heart." Yet these guys are showing up here at David's lowest moment. We don't know if David really wanted them there or not. I don't know if David wanted his family around or not. But what does he do? He finds a safe place for them to be. He says, I'm going to send you guys to Moab so Saul can't get you. If Saul wants to get to his family, he's going to have to go into another territory. He's going to have to create war with another country to get to you guys, just so we know what we're talking about. Here's where David is, roughly the area where David is, the cave here. And this is kind of the whole area where he'll be bouncing around throughout this whole episode. Here's Moab over here in this section. On the other side of the river, on the other side of the Dead Sea, Saul's going to have to do quite a lot to get to David's family. So he ensures his family's safety. God's given him a purpose. God's given him a way to be a leader. Then God sends him some other men. And he sends him ruffians, just a band of no good guys. These guys are stressed out. They can't pay their bills. It says they're discontented. The meaning behind the Hebrew word is they're bitter in their souls. Probably because they're living under the oppression that Saul has created. You remember what Samuel said about kings and reminded the people what the kings would do to them. Well, people are getting fed up with that. So now he's got these guys who aren't going to pity him and who aren't going to have sympathy on him. They're going to challenge him. They're going to challenge him to step up and to be a leader. God's giving David a way to have purpose in this dark time, a way to be a leader. This is an answer. He goes into the cave out of fear, and it's going to end up being a way to challenge him and to train him, just like Luke goes into the cave out of fear, and he finds a way to be trained. These guys, David would train them to be guys of character, guys of bravery, guys who would do great deeds. They are the mighty warriors later on in 2 Samuel that they speak of. There would be a guy named Joshabin who would kill 800 people in one battle. There would be another guy named Benaiah who would not only kill a fully armed Egyptian with just a club in his hand, but he would also chase a lion on a snowy day into a pit and kill it. There would be Eleazar, who would stand alone with David and fight Philistines until he could no longer lift his sword. These are the guys who show up there and wrestle in the dark times with David. Loyal men who are inspired because they're in the trenches with him. They would be so loyal to him that at one point David says, I'm thirsty, and they would break through the Philistine lines to go get water to bring back to David. Friends in the darkest hour. became loyal friends for David for life. God brought him what he needed in answer to his prayer. He was training him to be the ruler, to understand compassion, to understand where these guys are coming from, because he's going through it too. The poor and the oppressed would matter to David because that's what these guys were, and that's what David was at this point in the cave. And then, after praying to God, and after God giving him a reason to keep going, giving him something to do, then he gets up and he leaves the cave. Gad will come. Prophet Gad will come. And he'll tell David, leave the stronghold. Go back into the wilderness of Judah. Now this mention of Gad is actually significant because it shows that there's a prophet leaving King Saul and coming to David. Individual people didn't just have a prophet. All right? The prophet, the priest, they supported the king. Well, now there's no prophets for Saul. The priests are not for Saul. Saul just killed Abiathar. Just killed him. So now it's shifting to David. Everything's shifting over to David. And David will leave, and his life and the lives of his men would be spared. Unlike Nob, the people of Nob are not so fortunate. Saul will kill an entire village trying to chase David down. But David sings and prays. He doesn't get stuck in the sulking. He doesn't get stuck in the cave. He does what God asked him to do, uses the opportunities that God brings him to use. And then he gets up and he goes out and he leaves the cave. But he doesn't just leave the cave. He goes and he helps other people. When David hears that the Philistines are attacking a town called Keilah, he says, we got to go help these guys. And he asks God, and with God's blessing, they go to help the town of Keilah. And they do. They manage to push back the Philistines, and Saul learns that they're there, and he says, yes, I've got him. I've got him now. He's in a walled city, and we can just go and trap him. Well, God gets David out of that scenario too. David and his men escape from Keilah, and he doesn't end up having to confront Saul in that situation. He left the cave, and he went to help others. And God's making this work. God's making this work out for him. Then he bounces around for a little while, bounces around from place to place, sort of playing hide and seek with Saul, until finally he ends up in another cave. And this time he ends up in the cave around the cliffs of En-Gedi, and Saul's looking all over for him. Saul knows where he is, and he can't seem to find him. The reason he can't seem to find him, this is En-Gedi. Just so we know, this is the area of En-Gedi. On the map you saw was the little bitty right by the Dead Sea. So this is the Dead Sea, and this is the area right here of En-Gedi. These cliffs where David is. Now the reason that it's such a problem, obviously David doesn't have a whole lot of place to go. If Saul's coming from over here, David doesn't have a place to go. But this is the cliffs of En-Gedi from a close-up view. So there's a lot of little bitty caves, little bitty things that could be a place for somebody to hide. This is where David is hiding. Well, Scripture says it just so happens that Saul shows up and he's got to use the bathroom. And he shows up in David's cave to use the bathroom. And David's in the cave. And again, when it says just so happens, things don't just so happen. God, again, using this cave as a way of training for David. David, this time in the cave, chooses something different. David chooses mercy. He can end this right now. The murderous dictatorship that Saul has been perpetrating on him and on the people, he could stop it. He could stop all this despair, all this madness of jumping around from wilderness to Judah, all of this stuff. Stop it right now. And his men try to get him to. His men encourage him, go kill him. Let's end this. But David can't do it. It says he crept forward and he cut off a piece of Saul's robe. And then David's conscience began to bother him because he had cut off Saul's robe. So picture David's tiptoeing towards the front of the cave. Saul's there at the front. His men are way at the back. And he's tiptoeing up to the front. And all this time he's thinking, I can take all this stuff I've been through. I can end this now. He's tempted. The temptation's high. Kill Saul. Take care of this. Think of what he's lost. Think of all the despair we read in that song. And he gets up there and he just can't do it. So he cuts off the robe and goes back to his men and says, look, I cut the robe off, but I couldn't kill him. You guys aren't going to kill him. We're not going to kill this guy. But even cutting off his robe, even ruining the king's robe bothers David so much because in some way he's attacked God's anointed. Nothing just happens with God involved. David is learning how to be a merciful king because God has shown him mercy, has shown him providence. And Saul, on the other hand, has mercilessly slaughtered people, slaughtered a whole village. And David has to come out of the shadow of this evil king He has to come out of that shadow and has to stop living under the shadow of the fact that he's going to be this future king. And mercy has to be the hallmark. Mercy is the hallmark of any follower of God, and it has to be the hallmark of a leader of God's people. So he goes out and he says, I could have killed you, Saul. He says, God's going to be my advocate. God's going to be the one who's going to rescue me from you. Well, Saul realizes he goes, whoo, man, I escaped that one right there. And he says, okay, David, I'm not going to chase you down anymore. Promise me that you won't go after my family. When you become king, promise me you won't go after my family. Because that was typical back then. When you replaced a king, you went out and you got rid of his whole bloodline so that nobody could claim heirship to the throne. David makes a promise, okay, I won't do that, Saul. And for a time, Saul goes away and he leaves David alone. Right? Feel bad. Oh, I tried to kill him and he had a chance. He could have run me through and he didn't do it. So now it seems like for a while David's problems are going to get a little bit better. But these cave experiences were training opportunities for David to learn what it would mean to be a king after God's own heart. Not just a man after his own heart, but a leader after his own heart. David has to escape out of the shadow of Saul. Saul is not a good king at this point, but it's what people know, and David has to come out of that. You know, it's always kind of the bad thing to be the rebound guy in any situation. You don't want to be the rebound guy. David writes another song about his experience in the caves. This is what his Psalm 57, he writes in the caves. He says, have mercy on me, O God, have mercy. I look to you for protection. I will hide beneath the shadow of your wings until the danger passes by. I cry out to God Most High, to God who will fulfill his purpose for me. He will send help from heaven to rescue me, disgracing those who hound me. My God will send forth his unfailing love and faithfulness. And with this, I love the imagery of beneath the shadow of your wings. David was in the shadow of despair. He lives in the shadow of the king Saul that he has to come out from underneath. And another psalm, Psalm 23, he writes, in the valley of the shadow of death. He's in the shadow, a lot of things going on. We all live in someone's shadow. We live in someone or something's shadow. Whether we live in the shadow of not having such a stellar past, whether we live in the shadow of guilt of something we've done to hurt somebody, whether we live in the shadow of something that somebody else is perpetrating upon us, whether we live in the shadow of not understanding what our current circumstances are doing, this shadow that seems to hover over us, this swirling chaos of confusion. Maybe it's the shadow of a well-respected and great parent who we'll never think we'll live up to. Those expectations are just so high and we have to come out from under the shadow of that person. There's also another aspect of the shadow. And every time you go to the zoo on a hot, sweltering summer day, where are the animals at the zoo? They're in the shade. What's the shade? It's shadows. It's shadows of trees. It's shadows of buildings. It's shadows of rocks creating that shade. And what do? We do the same thing. We're instinctive. We run to the shade. We run to the shadows to get out of the heat. When the heat is on, where do you run to? Where's your shadow that you run to? Do you know where God's wings are that create his shade, that create his shadow? On the arms of the cross. His wings that create the shadow of refuge. Sometimes the Christian life is like we're in a cave, like David. That we're deep in dark despair. We find ourselves in the pit. We find ourselves things aren't working out. And when we find ourselves in that kind of place, we can be honest with God. We can be honest with each other. We should be able to be honest with God and with each other the way David was in that psalm. We can find purpose in the opportunities that God gives us. What opportunities is he giving in those things? To train, to learn, to grow. What kind of tasks can we do instead of sulking? Instead of having a pity party, what can we do? What can we do to come out from under the shadows that threaten us? The rest in the shade created by the cross. Too often, we miss that. Jesus gathered a bunch of discontented people around him, a bunch of lowly people, a bunch of sinners like us around him. He changed the world. They were enemies to the kingdom, and he changed it. They were people cowering in darkness. But they became a refuge of encouragement. They didn't have, of critics, a refuge of encouragement. There's a book written called The Edge of Adventure. And in this he writes, the neighborhood bar is possibly the best counterfeit there is to the fellowship Christ wants to give his church. It's an imitation. Dispensing liquor instead of grace, escape rather than reality. But it is permissive, accepting, and inclusive fellowship. It's unshockable. It's democratic. You can tell people secrets, and they usually don't tell others or even want to. The bar flourishes not because most people are alcoholics, but because God has put into their human heart that desire to know and to be known, to love and to be loved. Christ wants his church to be unshockable, democratic, permissive, a fellowship where people can come in and say, I'm sunk, I'm beat, God have mercy on me. But too often our churches miss it. The question is, can we be the place where we are resting in the shadow of his wings, to encourage each other and to encourage other people to come out of the caves, to help others and to rely on God? That's our challenge as we go forward, to rest in the shadow of his wings and to communicate that rest to others. Let's pray. Father God, I know that there are people here that are struggling with things right now. I know that there are people here that are struggling with situations they have with others. I know that there are people struggling with being under shadows of something in one way or another. Father, we want to rest in your shadow. We want to put our hope and our entire lives into your hands. Lord, I know that it's a struggle sometimes to come out of the cave of despair. Lord, help through your Spirit that this story of David may encourage us, that you are working with us even through those times, that you are here helping us to grow through those times, that we can lean on one another, that we can lean on one another as your body. I pray, Lord, that we will encourage one another and that we will learn how to encourage others to take refuge in you. In Jesus' name, amen.